All right, welcome to Empires and Pages. So today's book will be Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics by John J. Mearsheimer. So I thought this would be a good book to start off with as our first video on the channel. It's small, but it's, I think, a topic that's quite interesting, and it'll really, I think, give a good nuanced understanding on the idea of lying and statecraft and how it works together. Because, well, we tend to have a pretty, usually people don't like to lie, or as in, we don't like to hear our leaders lie. And you would be surprised that it happens not just for selfish reasons, but also for very strategic reasons. And we will go through this book. Now, John Mearsheimer is, I think, quite an excellent political scientist. And he really does know how to break things down into really, how do I say it? They're quite clear. It's very clear and concise in his work. So he makes some main arguments in his book. First, that international lying comes in a variety of forms, but most important distinction is between the lies that states tell each other and the lies that states tell their own public. So, if Russia and the United States were having diplomatic talks in each other, they are actually less likely to lie to each other than for Russia and the United States to lie to their own people. And in fact, it is quite large as to how much the difference is. Secondly, he talks about how leaders usually tell international lies for good reasons, and like good strategic reasons specifically, not because of some selfish or corrupt reason. The fallouts of lying to another country, in many cases, historically, as we've seen, can be, well, it can lead to a nuclear Armageddon, which we will actually get into an example about that later on. He wants to emphasize that lying isn't good, but like I said, as it's a good virtue, but there's a useful and strategic reason when it comes to statecraft. He likes to quote Plato as saying there's a noble lie, you have a noble cause for doing it. So his third reason is lying among states is a permanent fixture of international politics. It is not commonplace. So he describes a variety of cases in which the leaders of one state lied to another state. And he'll get more in depth with this. Fourth, the most dangerous kinds of international lies are those that leaders tell to their own citizens. Now, I know I mentioned earlier that, if you lie to another state, some of the outcomes could be like nuclear war, but also remember, lying to your own people isn't always smart, especially if it's pertaining to, well, let's be frank here, not being completely transparent about the Epstein files and hiding stuff and lying isn't a smart move to do to your people. Now, lying to your people about certain sensitive classified information that has to deal with national security and safety of troops, whatever, maybe you're in a time of war and you tell them, no, we're not doing this, or no, we don't have this weapon or technology, yeah, that would make more sense. But really, the Epstein files, let's be quite clear here. There is no strategic or beneficial or noble cause for lying about that. And I think 99% of Americans can agree on that. It's very likely to even backfire, he goes to say. And when a lie like that can backfire. It can be quite detrimental. And in many ways, a lot of it's because they're corrupt that they make these lies to their own citizens. And it's just quite unfortunate. That's really a cultural problem we have among the West. But it's not just in the West, it's in many other countries. And the fifth reason, and pertaining to the United States, he says that because the United States is so powerful and so heavily engaged around the globe, its leaders often confront situations where there are strong incentives to lie either to other states or to American people. This is a matter of serious concern since international lying can have serious negative consequences, especially for democracies like the United States. Now, what's interesting about this is that when he mentions about our power, now, Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Now, Uncle Ben's famous quote here is very important when it comes to the United States. And the thing is that when he says our leaders often confront situations where there's a strong incentive to lie, in many ways, we get into these situations when we don't need to. And many of it is because of corruption, greed, all these different reasons. And in many ways, we like to get our hands into places that we really don't need to put our hands in. And it ends up having us to, turn around and lie to the people about these situations. So, moving on to chapter 1 on what is lying. He really wants to break down, first of all, on lying. There's different types of lying he wants to clarify. There's lying, spinning, and concealment. These are the 3 different general categories as to what it is. And those are kind of like actually behaviors as well. And you have another one called truth-telling, which is the direct opposite of, the deception, obviously. You're telling the truth. So he says truth-telling is when an individual does his best to state the facts and tell a story in a straightforward and honest way. Every person invariably has limited knowledge about the details of any case and basis as well. Memories can also be faulty, and it is impossible to relate every fact one knows when telling the story. The key point, however, is that a truth teller makes a serious effort to overcome any biases or selfishness that he might have and report the relevant facts in a fair-minded way as he can. So I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. He makes it up pretty clear. Just trying to be as honest as possible and not to try to put your own selfish biases in, put that in front of the truth. Now, at times, obviously it's not, you can't obviously get rid of everything, but there are certain biases that I would say are more truthful than others. But the point is, try to stick to the facts. Then he says deception, in contrast, is where an individual purposely takes steps that are designed to prevent others from knowing the full truth, in that individual understands it about a particular matter. Deliberate aim, in other words, is to not provide a straightforward or comprehensive description of events. Now, that's interesting is because you can basically say 20% truth, 80% lie, half truth. You kind of just mumbling it through to where you never really get the full picture, and it purposely leads people to just go down a rabbit hole that really ends up nowhere, and it's kind of like a large distraction in a sense. Lying is when a person makes a statement that he knows or suspects to be false in the hopes that others will think it is true. Pretty clear there. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that sometimes a person thinks that he's telling a lie, but has the facts wrong and is inadvertently telling the truth. And the reverse might be true. So it's not really a big, you know, it's not really a big deal. Very few have that, like, I guess you could say, like, it's almost like a Freudian slip. You don't really have people mismatching the truth and the lie, facts, much. But so now we're gonna move into one of the second terms after lying. It is spinning. Spinning is a different form of lying, although there will be some cases where the distinction is murky. Spinning is when a person is telling a story, emphasizing certain facts and links. Certain facts and links them together in ways that plays to his advantage, while at the same time downplaying or ignoring inconvenient facts. So, it's a murky thing. So Tiger Woods captured the essence of spinning when he told an interview in Sports Illustrated. He said, "I've learned you can always tell the truth, but you don't have to tell the whole truth." Just kind of going back to what I'm saying, and the deception part is that, you could just say 20% of it being true, but 80% is lying. If as long as you're good with words and know how to, spin it, no pun intended, you can get away with it. The basic story is told, right? But it's in a very distorted way. And not all the facts are in there. Now, moving on. When we go to the courtroom, witness is called to the stand, and they're sworn in to say the truth and nothing but the truth. The attorney is for the plaintiff and the defendant, on the other hand, are primarily interested in winning the case for their clients. They're not here to determine the full truth, in a sense. They're not there. Like, if I killed someone and it was caught on camera, right? And it's pretty clear, right? And there's even eyewitnesses or whatever. The whole point of my defendant, right? They're not there for the truth. They're there to just mitigate as much as they can. And what they're going to do is going to try and spin the whole thing and figure out a way to, essentially say that people's judgments, you could say, in one way, is not completely true. So, however, they can't lie in that case. The lawyer can't lie, but he might spin it. So that's what the lawyer would do. So that's just kind of like an example, I guess. So moving on, the third kind of dissension is concealment, which involves withholding information that might undermine or weaken one's position. So essentially, you just don't say it. A good example of concealment is the Bush administration's decision not to tell the public before the Iraq War began in 2003 that two key al-Qaeda figures, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah, had separately told their American interrogators that Osama bin Laden had thought about asking Saddam Hussein for a formal alliance against the United States, but then decided against it because one important part about the Iraq War, still why, other than the WMDs, was that, Saddam Hussein was, helping Al-Qaeda and terrorists. But Bush never mentioned that, Osama bin Laden actually decided not to go for his help. I'm trying to think of another example of where he withheld information. Um, well, there's a lot around 9/11 that's still withheld. You could say JFK that's still withheld. All those instances, you know, the government is purposely withholding information to where they're concealing it. So to reiterate, the three big types of lying. Lying is emphasized, usually considers deliberate, deplorable behavior that people believe it is acceptable to spin or conceal, even though these behaviors are designed to deceive. Liars make false assertions in ways that are designed not to raise any doubts about the truthfulness of their claims. So, now on spinning, however, the listeners are much more likely to be able to recognize that they're not getting a complete and accurate picture. So, in many ways, it's actually harder to spin because part of what you're doing is you're partly saying the truth, right? And it was someone that's skilled enough to do that and understand maybe more on the subject. They're able to see right through it sometimes. But, you know, if you have a population that is all hell bent on, you know, drugs, sex, video games, money, all that stuff, hedonism in a sense, spinning becomes a lot easier. And because people aren't educated and their focus is on things that are just temporary and get them nowhere, it really actually just makes you dumber in a sense. But anyway, they can even compare your motives as well. One thing that's interesting, they can compare your motives as to why you're spinning it. If we move on to concealment, back again, it can always someone defending the audience, you know, should be able to defend themselves once against concealment. They can always ask if there's information available on specific aspects of the subject at hand, and it should expect to be told the truth. None of this is to deny, however, that the target audience may not know all the relevant inquiries. After all, sometimes you do not know what you do know. This is the famous one. After all, sometimes you do not know what you do not know, and therefore you do not know what questions to ask. It's like, here's an example. A case in which two individuals are bargaining over a commodity like a car or house. Each person is allowed to lie about his reservation price, which is the price above or below which he would no longer agree to the deal. Both the buyer and the seller understand that lying, the euphemism is bluffing, is part of the game. Thus, neither side gains an unfair advantage when it lies about selling price or the purchase price. In essence, we're talking about a fair fight in which neither side can claim that it is wrongly bamboozled by the other side. So this is like a common form of, you could say lying, but it's more you're not lying to gain advantage. It's nobody actually gains a bigger footing in a sense by withholding that. Now, if we move on to really the whole chapter Lying, spinning, and withholding information are all forms of deception, and all three can be contrasted with truth-telling. The subsequent discussion focuses on how lies are used to deceive others in foreign policy realm. But in practice, deception campaigns invariably involve spinning and concealment as well as lying. In fact, given the opprobrium attached to most kinds of lying, leaders who think that they have any good reason to deceive another state or their own public usually prefer spinning or concealment to lying. Because really, if you're really that rash to outright just completely build a false story and withhold information and make a entirely false narrative from beginning to the end, the backlash, if that were to be revealed, the truth, would be enormous. Much more so than if you were to just like spin or conceal some things. And the key is some things, not all. Now, let's go into the real world examples of international lies. So, we're going to start with the first paragraph in this, and it'll really give us a good picture of how this chapter what will happen and what we'll see. So in foreign policy realm, leaders can tell several different kinds of lies. Each type serves a specific purpose, although a single lie can serve multiple purposes. For example, a lie that a leader tells his people about foreign threat to generate public support for countering it. Fear-mongering might also foster nationalism on the home front by portraying the adversary as an especially harsh light. This is national myth-making. So you just use two things in one: fear-mongering and national myth-making. This particular kind of lies aimed at policymakers' own public, but lies can also be beamed at rival states as well as allies. However, a lie directed at any one of these audiences will invariably reach the others, which might have positive or negative consequences. I think there we go. In the recent conflict with Venezuela, when we went to Venezuela and we found Maduro, took him and his wife here to the United States. Now, before we did this, they were trying to generate a public support, in a sense, by framing Maduro and Venezuela as like the main supplier of fentanyl and cartels and drugs in the United States, and that they're a threat. And that's where the fear-mongering comes in. And what it does is, the point of it is to try and bolster support and nationalism in the United States, for people to go, yeah, we need to actually help our own people, and we need to, stand for America, and we need to protect our borders. We need to help our people, stop the fentanyl from coming in. And this, what it does is it causes that's where the national myth making comes in. So you portray the adversary in an inescapably harsh light. So you make them look really bad. He peddles fentanyl, cartels, all these bad things about him, right? And it's lies peddled up in order to, for our own advantage. That's why we kind of went in, took it. Now, the thing is in this case, it's not a complete lie. It's more, again, spinning. Because that's really what's more common, what's better. Because what's happening is, yes, there is a truth in this, Maduro and Venezuela does have fentanyl. They do have cartels. They do have gangs. They have come into the United States. They have caused violence. Maduro's a communist. It's horrible what's going on in Venezuela. They're starving. He's not a good guy by all means. But is Maduro the leading cause? Is that regime the leading cause as to the illegal immigration and the fentanyl coming into the United States? Is it, the leading cartel country, with a bunch of violent cartels and gangs? I would say no. Your biggest supplier of fentanyl to Latin America and into the United States, especially even Canada now recently, is China. I haven't seen us going into Beijing and abducting Xi Jinping, right? But you guys get the point. So we're gonna move on to interstate lies. They're aimed directly at other countries. So I want to make something clear. There's two terms we need to know: interstate and intrastate. Interstate is from one country to another. So US and Russia, that's interstate. We are having a war with them, or we're having talks with them, negotiations with them, trade with them. That's interstate, fill in the blank. Intrastate is within the country. So like a civil war, intrastate conflict. So, but now interstate lying, that's where we do that to gain strategic advantage over them. And that would prevent them from gaining an advantage at our expense. So, however, you gotta understand that the interstate lying, what's interesting about it is while you are lying to the other state, that also means you're lying to us, to their own people. So if the US lies to Russia about something, we aren't going to, I don't know, if we are going to have weapons in this area, right? In Turkey, we don't have nuclear weapons in Turkey to the USSR. But then we've also lied to the Americans by saying that we don't have nuclear weapons to Turkey and in Turkey. But the point is that it's the main audience is Russia, not us. So moving on to fear mongering, really want to kind of define that a bit more. It's mostly when leaders, this is where intrastate lying, the leaders are lying to their own people about a foreign policy threat. We're going to just build up this giant fear mongering around the problem is it's not like we make fear mongering about, the penguins in Antarctica are a grave threat to our existence. Usually what will happen is we'll find someone or some group that have behaviors, ideologies that are, one, not good, and they are violent, but in a sense, they're not always this existential threat. I think you can say Israel does this a lot, right? But it all depends on your own actions as well. Your own actions could actually fuel that to cause them to later on become a big threat to your nation. So it's not necessarily because our leaders are evil that they do this fear mongering, but it's more of selfish gain. I guess you can say, yes, morally, selfish gain isn't good, right? But in a sense, it's more, sometimes it can be for a selfish national interest, right? We don't want China to beat us in the economic race in the world, right? So we're going to portray them as in a, we're going to portray them under a very bad light. Now, some of it will be true, but some of it will also be false. So moving on, strategic cover-ups, they're lies designed to hide failed policies or controversial policies from the public, and sometimes from other states as well. Well, this is pretty popular. I could say MK Ultra. When people found out about that, they had Harvard and many of the universities and the institutions like the CIA that were involved within these programs of brainwashing and trying to do mind control of people. When people found out, they started destroying all these documents and covering it up. So we only have part of the picture of the story of MK Ultra, and we probably will never find out the full picture because those documents have been permanently destroyed. So he said that they don't tell these lies to protect implement incompetence. The aim is instead to protect the country from harm. Now, MK Ultra example, I wouldn't say is necessarily you're protecting the country from harm, because MK Ultra is a very harmful project that the CIA did. However, there are failures that we have done that we lie about because we don't want people to know, because it can be harmful to us domestically, like in morale, but also other countries can find out when you publicly say it, and they'll go, oh, this country, United States isn't as strong as we thought it was. So he gives actually a good example. Lying to the public about military incompetence in wartime is sometimes important for maintaining solidarity on the home front, which can mean the difference between defeat and victory. I mean, yeah. So let's move on to national myth making. So leaders tell lies mainly to their own people about the country's past. In essence, they tell a story in which we are always right and they are always wrong. It's very important for the elites to always, subvert history and tell it in the wrong lens. And it leads people to either have such negative outlook on history, or let me get more specific. You have like the one lens where it's like this Marxist view, which is very common amongst the educational realm. And what happens is that you view everything as like oppressed versus oppressor, like there's always someone that's getting oppressed and there's always someone that's doing the oppression, right? There's no in between, right? There's no wiggle room, and they have to see like, oh, we have to fix that. That's always a problem and we have to fix it. That gets into a huge victim mentality, and it's quite frankly dangerous, right? And then you have the other one, which is more of the national myth making, and where you kind of trump up of, oh, we never did anything wrong. America was always the best. We're like pure moral people. This is the shining hill on top of a city. The shining city on top of a hill, excuse me. You've heard this in the past by, I think, Madeleine Albright. I think she was one of the first people said it. I think Reagan said it too, if I remember correctly. So again, the point is to make us look like a myth, some great myth beyond. And what it does is it really just helps you manipulate the people and move them to follow your policies in whichever way you want it. Now, here's another one called liberal lies. Now, it's not necessarily the kind of liberal that we think of in a sense. They're designed to cover up behavior of states that contradicts the liberal norms, as in, like, your democratic liberal society. So, for instance, we, let's say, so we're a democracy supposed to be, or like in Western Europe too, and what most of Europe is. And the point is that you're supposed to have freedom of speech, your Bill of Rights, individualism, in a sense, responsibility, democracy, people get to vote. And then you do something that hinders the voting process or the capability for people to vote somewhere, even in your own state. But you don't talk about that. You lie and you don't say that ever happened, right? So that kind of just contradicts the entire idea that you're a democracy. Why would we be a democracy then do that? So, and it's another example is like we would act in very violent ways towards other states. Hell, we were about to look. We were about to form an alliance with Mussolini, right? Mussolini was going to work with us. Or actually, in fact, no, that's not a good example. A better example, we formed an alliance with the Soviet Union, with Stalin. That man is responsible for the deaths of at least 20 million people. Communist, dictator, ruthless, criminal, did horrible things to millions and millions and millions of people, right? Not democratic in any sort of the way, not liberal in any sort of the way, as in he didn't guarantee the rights that you think we deserve, like freedom of speech. But you couldn't speak out against him. He'd disappear, never show up again. But we worked with a country like that. So I guess, in a sense, in fact, we even supported the Bolshevik Revolution. We supported the revolution in Russia during World War I. We put in a lot of money to help prop up those revolutions to overthrow Russia, the Orthodox monarchy there, and put in the communist regime under Lenin. Moving on, we're going to go to social imperialism. Oh, this is interesting. They would tell a lie about another country for the purpose of promoting either their own economic or political interest, or those of a particular social class or interest group. You divert the public's attention, right, from problems and controversies like, I don't know, the Epstein files, that'd be a great one. They would divert it from the home front and they push something else, then bring your attention to something outside, something foreign, like Venezuela. They might try to solidify their hold on power by exaggerating a threat and creating fear on the home front, which in turn will lead the public to rally around the regime. Moving on, we'll talk about ignoble cover-ups. The ignoble cover-ups are when leaders lie about their own mistakes or unsuccessful policies for serving reasons. You messed up? Okay, own up to it. But you don't. You lie and lie, you obfuscate, you scapegoat, find someone else to blame it on. Then, we'll move on to a variety of falsehoods. Falsehoods that encompass the international laws. There are two types of falsehoods are omitted because they're not really strategic. Now, for you, And those are really the different tons of lying between or I would say, cover-ups. And to end it all, let's say, quote Mearsheimer in this paragraph, says strategic lies are a different matter. They aim to facilitate the general welfare, and they usually have at least a modicum of legitimacy. In essence, strategic lies can do good things for a country, although there are always the possibility that they will do more harm than good. So moving on, we will go into why and when you get different kinds of international lies. Okay. So the line between states, so we'll talk about Sir Henry Wotton, Wotton Watson. He's a British diplomat from the 17th century. He's known to be an honest man. But he is known to what they would do is, like, he was known as an honest man, but they'd send him overseas to Hawaii for the benefit of the British Empire. But however, it implies that diplomats, though, that's what they do, right? In a sense, but not necessarily. They're not just there to pretend to be honest and then go and just lie all the time. No. They have a purpose, really, to not lie, actually, and it's good for them to be honest. So, Mearsheimer really wants to emphasize that there hasn't been much interstate lying over time. And it's based on two reasons. First, I had difficulty finding examples of leaders lying to each other. This is what Mearsheimer said. Although I certainly found some cases, much of which are discussed below, I also asked other scholars who are well-versed in international history if they could provide me with examples of statesmen and diplomats lying to one another. Their initial reaction, like mine, was that there must have been an abundance of such cases, but in the end, virtually everyone I approached had trouble finding more than a few clear-cut cases of interstate lying. So, what we're seeing here is, again, like I said in the very beginning, was that interstate lying is, well, it's not as common as we think it is. It's very few. One might argue that statesmen and diplomats who lie to each other are not going to admit it, and indeed are likely to go to some lengths to hide it. But there are not that many well-concealed international states lying lurking in the past. And that's really just the truth of the matter. Now, there's another reason why interstate lying is not uncommon. Is uncommon. that we discussed in the first season that there aren't really much because it's not really in the big interest because it's so can be so dangerous. But the other reason is it's usually difficult to bamboozle another country's leader. The cost of lying often outweighs the benefits because, first of all, when you're bamboozling and lying to your own people, you're lying to a group of people through the lens of your own people. You already were. If I was the leader of the United States and I were to lie to the United States, I would understand the people of the United States better than I would understand the people of Vietnam. You know, the cultural and the ways in which you can interact with your own population, I understand better because I'm from that population. So, states operating in an anarchic system have powerful incentives to sometimes act in ruthless and deceitful ways to ensure their survival. So, an anarchic system is a system of international rules where the hierarchy of people is uh the hierarchy of states, there really isn't much of a hierarchy. It's just, put it simply, big fuck small. You know, there is, if your state is in deep shit from a more powerful country, right? And there's no others, there's no system to where you can basically call 911 and they could bail you out. And that's really an anarchic system. There's no other country that's gonna be there to be your saving grace. And I would say for the most part that's true. And it's how the world runs. And he says that in this system, because there's powerful incentives for survival and to stay strong because you don't want to get beaten up by someone else, right? Yeah, you have good reasons to lie. And like former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, he said, for the sake of the land of Israel, it's all right to lie. But so long as it's the matter of the state and it's for the survival of the state and it's for national security needs, actually that, they can make, you'll see them lie more, right? But they'd have even good reasons to lie. But if it's really for selfish reasons like the Epstein files, you know, their lying was going to be really hard and it's really going to be selfish and there's really no good national security reason for it. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verified. And here's a good example. No Western leader is going to accept Iran's claim that it is not developing nuclear weapons and leave the issue there. Instead, they will insist that the International Atomic Energy Agency in the IAEA would inspect them, the nuclear facilities, and make sure that they aren't trying to. So it's kind of like what Reagan say, trust but verify. I get it, you know. They'll say, Iran says we're not making nuclear weapons. We think they're lying, but just in case, they're gonna get inspected. That's kind of like the agreement. But nah, I don't know if it's like that right now. As of January of 2026, I think we still they've pulled out since the strikes. So, final reason for often leaders lie to each other is it's almost impossible for them to interact in constructive ways since nobody would know what to think is true or false. Yeah, if you're known for lying all the time, Israel, you know, it's kind of hard to trust you. No, we're in that same shoe, I guess, as well, to be quite honest, because we what happens is if you're going to just keep lying all the time to other countries, your trust in diplomacy is going to go down. And that's what we've seen in the war in Ukraine. We say we want peace or we want this to end, but then we just keep pushing the Ukrainians to keep fighting and keep supporting them. Like under Biden, I think 3 months into the war, there was negotiations that were brokered by Turkey and Israel for Ukraine and Russia, and they almost came to a deal. They were so close, they were about to do it, but then we told Ukraine to pull out of the deal. Why would you even do that? What the hell? So much for being all about peace, huh? And safety. We just told Ukraine they were going to accept the deals, the terms of Russia, and Russia was going to accept the terms of Ukraine as well. But we pulled out, and here we are, 3 years later now, still trucking on. We're pushing up 4 now, I think. Yeah, 2022. So as I said earlier, the reason why the states would lie to each other is that they operate in an anarchic world where there is no night watchman to protect them in case of serious trouble. They have no choice but to provide for their own security. So that means you gotta lie sometimes. So like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Arthur Sylvester, he's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs during the Kennedy administration. He said, I think the inherent right of the government to lie to save itself when faced with nuclear disaster is basic. I think most people would agree with that. Jimmy Carter even commented on that and said that in certain circumstances, the government is right not only to lie, but it's got a good it has a positive duty. You actually have to lie, if you don't want to just get wiped out by nuclear weapons. Sometimes they'll exaggerate their state's capabilities. You'll exaggerate how good you are. Hitler lied about German military capabilities during the 1930s. He tried to infiltrate the Wehrmacht's strength, so as to discourage Britain and France from interfering with German rearmament, as well as aggressive foreign policy moves like remobilization of the Rhineland in 1936. Joseph Stalin, infamous purges also did serious damage to the fighting power of the Red Army, because he kept abducting people all the freaking time, millions of them, putting them in labor camps where they die off. Well, you can't have an army if you keep doing that. So he kind of inflate the idea of how strong the Soviet force was. I need some water. Doing a lot of talk. I hope you guys are finding this helpful. Ow. If we move on, sometimes we'll even make ourselves, I get the example that we might inflate or make ourselves look stronger than what we actually are. We might, in fact, the reverse even happens. We might even say that we are weaker than what we are in order for our adversaries to become arrogant, because arrogance really will it's like, pride cometh before the fall. So arrogance is really what can get them to mess up. You might downplay what military weapons you have, where they are. You could hide them, not tell people where they are or in other states, so they might do a wrong move and be like, surprise, you know. Maybe some examples for the guys, like some, yeah, you could disguise an attack too if you lie. So the best example, Hitler's efforts between 1933 and 1938 to convince the other European powers that he was committed to peace when he was actually bent on war. Actually, yeah, the Ukraine example is also great. If it resists with Germany, he said in August 1934, war will not come. If it rests with Germany, war will not come again. This country has a more profound impression than any other of the evil that war causes. In our belief, Germany's present-day problems cannot be settled by war. And in a famous speech in the Berlin Sports Palace during the tension-filled days just before the infamous Munich Agreement was signed, he boldly stated that his desire to acquire the Sudetenland for Germany is the last territorial claim which I will have to make in Europe. Both statements were obvious lies. So he basically says, no, I'm not this bad guy you think I am. All I want is this. Look, if we come to agreement, this is all the peace I want. All I want is this land. That's it. I'm not going to go for any more. Obviously, that's not true. He went everywhere, as much as he could. And if you even read Mein Kampf, he just talks about where he wants to go. He hated the Eastern Europeans. But I guess to a similar extent, we kind of told Ukraine to pull out of the agreements with Russia during the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. And, although we talk about how much peace we want, in a sense, but we also just have such huge hatred and irresponsible Russophobia. It's so irresponsible and just really just honestly gonna get us in deep shit if we don't stop. Let's see. Another kind of state lying is when a country attempts to affect the behavior of a rival state by threatening to attack it, even though it has no intention of actually starting a war. Hey, here's a good one. The Chinese spy balloon, that little craze that happened, or that supposed weather balloon, was flying over the entire continent of the United States, but it came from China. It's a spy balloon that we shot down later on. Well, you could say that China was, in a sense, testing what we would do. They're trying to see how we would react, and they would use that to determine their military strategies later on, maybe with Taiwan. You could provoke another state into attacking their state or another country. Again, Russia-Ukraine war. This has a long history of us essentially just creeping NATO from West Germany all the way to the border, to the Russian border, and repeatedly over time and time again. The Russians said, no, please stop. This is a grave threat to our national security. This is existential. Excuse me. But we just kept refusing and essentially just tried to push their button and goad them into attacking. And yes, they did. Now we have a nasty freaking war on our hands. And it's very, very, very sad that it has to be like this. I'll give you a good example with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, where a leader is supposedly giving another country casus belli, which is essentially carte blanche, like you could do whatever you want. or not really. No, that's carte blanche. Casus belli is like a legitimate um, justification for why you would go to war to attack his own state, and he did it with the help of well-to-do, well-told lies. The Prussian chancellor was committed to creating a unified Germany, and if he provoked France into a war, um, the crisis would throw France into a state of turmoil, and that would help achieve their goal. Because France was Prussia's biggest rival at the time, and if you can destabilize France, you could easily just take control of more land and get your Prussian state that you want. And that's how actually Otto von Bismarck was able to defeat Napoleon. He was an excellent. I mean, they're both excellent leaders, but really, that was the killing blow. And not Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon III. Gotta make that clear. Seventh, a country that is worried about its allies are not paying enough attention to dangerous rival states might lie about the adversary's capabilities or behavior to make it look more menacing to its allies. Ooh. Now, this is interesting. I got two examples. One, when Bush in 2005 said that North Korea was a bigger threat for China, Japan, and South Korea, and that it didn't fully appreciate the seriousness of the threat of North Korea. And to get their attentions, the National Security Council went to Asia and made the case that North Korea had sold Libya hexafluoride, the uranium hexafluoride, which helps make nuclear weapons. So, like, we basically told them a lie. Now, Pakistan was the one that actually got that compound from North Korea, and it wasn't Libya. So they followed the lie in order to conflate that, in order to get more attention around it. But, yeah. Another one is you could say what Israel does is it conflates the threat around them. And that's not to say that the threat isn't legitimate. The threat of Hamas to Israel, the threat of Hezbollah to Israel, the threat of Iran to Israel are real, but the way they conflate it, and in fact, they would commit more acts of violence, or they might be more oppressive to the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Iranians, the Syrians, and whatnot. And it just kind of fuels a fire. They put the gasoline to the fire in order to bring more attention to why they are under threat, when they really are one of the big principal causes as to why the fire is so big. I guess you could say that's an example. Lie in order to get advantage in the course of a course of conducting military operations during wartime. Giant deception campaigns. Nazi and the Allies, so the Axis powers and the Allies, massive propaganda and deception campaigns to discredit each other. In fact, that's what's happening right now with Ukraine and Russia. There's massive deception campaigns on both sides to discredit each other. It'll actually get even worse when the war eventually comes to a halt and it kind of just becomes this like frozen conflict where there's just high tensions, but just like the things have stopped for the fighting has stopped for the most part, and there will be so much intense propaganda and campaign. However, the one thing that's interesting is most of these are lying during a war or there's some sort of conflict that you're trying to start or prevent. But during negotiations, it's different. There's really not much lying. So if we go to states tell each other lies, it's going to be interesting. You're more likely to tell a lie during a crisis than periods of the relative calm. In fact, you might start the crisis and tell a lie in order to fuel it more so you could bring the solution later on. But that's those are kind of hard, but they do happen. Yeah, like I said, wartime than peacetime, way more common to lie to each other. Yeah, when the shooting starts, the lying starts a lot more too. You're also more likely to lie to rival states than you are to allies because you're allies and obviously you don't want to lose that relationship. However, I would say there are a couple of exceptions. So Israel and the United States, we like to say that we're allies, but I don't know if you would call Israel an ally when they are one of the out of all the nations that spy on us the most. Your top three, if I remember correctly, are Russia, China, and Israel. Russia and China, we're not allies with them, but we're supposed to be allies with Israel, and that's how much they spy. And this was actually back in the 90s when this information came out, so it's even worse now. And, when you're spying on each other that much, there's so much lying. It's not really a relationship of allies. Anyways, so moving on to the next section, we're going to talk more about fear-mongering. So fear-mongering occurs when they see us as states leaders. The states leaders see a threat emerge, but they think that they cannot make a public see the wolf at the door without resorting to a deception campaign. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who worried that the American people might not fully appreciate the danger posed by the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, argued that it was necessary for American leaders to make their arguments clearer than truth, because otherwise the public would not support the measures that he thought were necessary to deal with the threat. The aim is not just to deceive the average person in the streets, but to also target educated elites, including outside experts who might be inclined to downplay the relevant threats in dangerous ways. So they might even do it to create a threat out of nothing. Like, they might just make up stuff out of something that's not even a threat. You could build support some sort of goal to contain it. And in many ways, that's usually it for selfish reasons. Let me see. short for. Okay, so the Bush administration, like you could say in '03, there's a lot of fear mongering around Iraq. We said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He was helping out, he was aiding and abetting Al Qaeda. There were a bunch of terrorists there, and they had chemical weapons and they were going to come after us. Even though none of that was really true. So, fear mongering, we got to understand why they do it, why the leaders would do it. And sometimes I would say that there are good national security reasons to fearmonger. In the case of the Thucydides trap, you could see a rival nation rise up in power, and you can go, oh crap, I don't want that to be more powerful than me because that could lead to a lot of problems. Therefore, I'm going to portray it right now in a very bad light so we can kind of contain it, i.e. China. But, there's also that, but I would say a lot of it is just selfish in a sense. Now, Mishra says that sometimes the only way to mobilize your citizens is to fearmonger, right? And some threats, your average person might not be able to understand why they're a threat. And that's okay, and what happens is leaders would tend to then resort to fear-mongering as an easy way to manipulate the people in order to, rally up against this adversary. Only problem is when your leaders aren't really guided by a good moral faith, and they don't have good standards, their use of fear-mongering is in many ways going to be bad and selfish. So he says that it is much harder to argue that educated elites who dispute the seriousness of a threat are either ignorant or dim-witted. This is especially true when you are dealing with experts on the issue at hand. It might be the case, however, that those educated and interested dissidents are perceived to have a wishy-washy view of international politics, and therefore some threat inflation is necessary to stiffen their backbones. It might also be the case that they are simply misreading the available evidence about the danger facing their country and drawing overly optimistic conclusions about the threat involved. If leaders cannot solve this problem by providing the misguided dissidents with more detailed information, the only solution left is fear-mongering. So, yeah, you want to rally the people, you could use fear-mongering, but ideally you want to inform them in the right way and help them realize this is not a threat in a sense, or this is a threat, but in the right way without stirring up fear and controlling people's emotions. But if you have the wrong worldview and the wrong lens in which you see things, yeah, it's going to be a problem if you misread or misunderstand how the world actually works. So having the corrective worldview is quite important. So why elites are likely to fearmonger. Now, we just mentioned why leaders do it, but elites, so the difference between leaders and elites in a sense, that they have similarities, but there's quite different. There's still clear differences. The leaders are the ones that, kind of, in the general sense, they'll guide your people, they'll show them the way, they, you know, run many of the day-to-day of the general operations, and they come up with stuff. The elites in many ways are actually the ones who come up with these ideas. They're the ones with the funding, right? So they, at the end of the day, kind of decide what that they kind of are the last person that makes the yes or no decision. Okay, now moving on to strategic cover-ups. It can take two forms. Leaders can lie about policy that is done badly or wrong. Leaders can also lie to hide a controversial but smart strategy because they fear it will meet serious public resistance and not be adopted. The Patriot Act, I could say, to a certain degree, they lied about something that would strategically benefit the leaders. That's more of a selfish thing, but if we really understood what exactly was in it and what it entailed, but it entailed a lot of breaching of our rights. So some of the, again, if you want to strategically lie, you have good reason. Hey, we don't, you don't want to try, you want to try and cover up the Bay of Pigs because that was a disaster. But, those things are not good. Bay of Pigs was not really something that we wanted, nor Kennedy wanted. But you don't want to necessarily hide our, a good strategic cover-up is actually, because like a bad one would be, you don't want to necessarily hide the Bay of Pigs, but a good one would be, you want to hide the fact that we have nukes in Turkey during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but then we remove them. Now, strategic cover-ups are more likely to happen when they cover it up because it's either failed or controversial policy from another country. They lie to another state because they think it is in the national interest. This means that leaders are more likely to engage in strategic cover-ups aimed at foreign audiences when their country is 1, located in a dangerous region, 2, involved in a crisis, 3, engaged in a war, or 4, dealing with a rivals rather than an ally. So those are kind of your reasons to strategically cover up when it comes to something that isn't really gonna look good. But you do this specifically to other countries. What about controversial policies? In many ways, controversial policies are usually because they're just not popular and it's just really selfish and it's something that nobody wants. It's like secretly passing digital IDs in a certain way. I don't know how they would do that, but you could say they quietly push for certain things and they cover up the fact that they want digital IDs. Digital IDs are not popular at all. Nobody wants them. But the elites do because they're because you can be easier to control. All right, so continuing with nationalist myths. So the rise of nationalist myths is where we kind of we liven up and really exaggerate and make the history of our nation look a lot better and basically like, oh, we look very good, and what we did was great. We did nothing wrong, and kind of bolsters this sense of nationalism. And the nationalism in itself isn't the problem. It's kind of really how you get there. And conversely, on the other side, you have this hypercritical view of our past, where it's like people see nothing good out of it, and it's like, oh, it's all bad, or like, as they'll say, like it was all racist and everything like that. It's like, so like, where are we going here? There's no good ending in a sense to it. Then they use this in order to bolster up the population. You want people on your side, so you make your group of people look way better. You reimagine the past, and it garners support, so you can have policies towards, and you can use this fervor and this nationalism actually against other nations in order to gain your power. You can even use it domestically too, against another group of people within your own country. Um, no, it happens quite often, but a good example would be Israel and its American friends went to great length after the events of 1948 to blame the expulsion of the Palestinians on the victims themselves. According to the myth that was invented, the Palestinians were not cleansed by the Zionists. Instead, they were said to have fled their homes because the surrounding Arab countries told them to move out, so that their armies could not move in and drive the Jews into the sea. The Palestinians could then return home after the Jews had been cleansed from the land. This story was widely accepted not only in Israel but also in the United States for about 4 decades, and it played a key role in convincing many Americans to look favorably upon Israel and its ongoing conflicts with the Palestinians. However, as time went on, scholars have demolished this myth. And in fact, you'd find that like many countries, Arab countries surrounding it, would actually punish the Palestinian Arabs that fled Palestine to these neighboring Arab countries. And it would be severe because they'd be like, you're just abandoning your own people, right? So there wasn't really this engagement to come here and we'll kick the Jews out and then you can go back, kind of thing. So moving on, we'll go on to liberal lies. Now, liberal lies are it's where you say you're one thing, but, kind of do the completely opposite. But in this case, we are a liberal democracy. We have a Bill of Rights, individualism, responsibility, democracy, it's representative government, and all that stuff. Now, our liberal lies is when we essentially cover up a behavior that contradicts those ideals in a sense. It includes invading other countries for strategic gains and launching preventative wars. Now, one clear thing about that is that the theory is that liberal democracies don't attack other liberal democracies, and that they more work together, or that it's a less violent type of system. And I would say that this is really reductionist because there are actual examples of us. See, like here, I'll show you. Amir Sharma quotes, he says, democracies are somewhat more likely than non-democracies to target civilians. The United States purposely killed about 900,000 Japanese civilians in the last 5 months of World War II. not because it feared losing the war, but because it wanted to win the war without having to invade Japanese homeland. General Curtis May, who's in charge of that campaign, has said that if we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And so that really contradicts the idea that liberal democracies are not as violent or less violent, and or that maybe we might work better with other. Actually, the one thing that's interesting is my professor says that it's a rule that it's like the only rule in international politics where democracies don't attack other democracies in a sense. But forget about the hundreds of regime changes we did with the CIA in Latin America and Africa and around the world, right? But because it's not an official war that we did, it doesn't really count. So it kind of really is just I think it's a dumb argument. So another case of liberal lives involved Nazi Germany's efforts to blame Poland for starting World War II. Hitler told the Reichstag that he had been patiently waiting for 2 days for the Polish government to send plenipotentiary to talk for him, but none arrived. So it's like they portrayed he portrayed himself as a person who loved peace, but it's the Polish that started the war. Now actually Hitler was elected into power, and so like it was like a democracy of sorts time. Now, why did they tell it? Now there are, so in many ways it's strategic, but it's also very selfish at times. Yeah, in many ways it's just done to just like justify why we killed so many people or why we did this. And that's kind of like the whole idea is, so long as you can portray that you're the good guy or that you have a good justification or lie as to why you killed so many people, right, in a country that you supposedly say is supposed to be for peace and all that. And that's what hell, Osama bin Laden even justified as to why he did 9/11. So, and really when is it likely that they are to lie? A good example is when America participates against Japan and Nazi Germany in World War II. That's they had easily defensible moral positions as to why they did it. So give them a lot of room as to why we, carpet bombed the shit out of Japan and Germany, and slaughtered hundreds and thousands, actually millions of people. And we had good reason to, and that was the whole point. So they made the Nazis look so bad that not even the devil can be worse. And that's really a big problem in this society today, is that we still make the Nazis as like the worst thing ever. But ignore the fact that we sided with the communists, right? Who actually slaughtered more people than the Nazis ever did. And I'm not justifying the Nazis here. I'm not saying that they're good, but it's just double standard thing that we do. And again, it's part of the lying. Now, what are the downsides of lying? Well, I'm sure some of it's pretty straightforward. You can get your country blown up. You could lose your election if you're being selfish about it. It could hurt your reputations. uh, as a country. Um, and people are less likely to engage with diplomatic. I'll give you a couple of examples. So, when we lie about when we lie to another country about, okay, let's go to the Cuban Missile Crisis. If we actually never properly solved that, and like maybe Kennedy said, or let's put it in the sense of, let's put it in the eyes of Soviet Union. Soviet Union we have the nukes, and Cuba, we're the Soviet Union, right? And, the US catches us with that. But if we keep lying, this could lead actually to literally just a straight up nuclear exchange. And that could get us killed, and the US killed, and everybody else killed. Another example on the diplomatic side is look at Russia and Ukraine. We say one thing and we do another, and as in, we want peace, but we'll just keep supplying everyone more weapons, and just fuck up all the negotiations and all that. So we don't really want peace. And this just does not look good, because other countries see us as, you're not being honest diplomats here. You're not being truthful. And so they're less likely to work with us on diplomatic solutions, which is very bad. Another example, Israel. We just keep giving them more guns, bombs, and bullets than they ever need. And the thing is everybody in the world hates that, because they just ruthlessly kill a bunch of people, right? On our taxpayer dollars, keep in mind too. And when other countries see that, they're like, what the hell? Why would we want to work with you guys if you're going to be like this all the time? So that's one. To go to fear mongering, a good reason how this could go bad is, well, if you start fear mongering a group of people or a state from another country, right, you could. And that backlash is because people realize, hey, there's no reason to actually hate them. This could lose, one, your entire election. Two, this could actually spur into a civil war, because what it could do is it still could break into factions. And then the myth making could lead to arrogance, a sense of strength that you don't actually had, which could get many people killed in your country, and that's not good. But anyways, that's really the gist of the book for Why Leaders Lie by John Mearsheimer. It's a small book, it's about 100 pages. Nothing much that is crazy about this, but it's good. It gives a really good nuanced approach as to why people lie. I want people to understand that, not everything that the leader says, obviously is truthful, but also not every lie that they said needs to be scrutinized. Sometimes when they have good reasons to lie for your protection, yeah. But we tend to just go after them for every lie and not take a step back and be like, why would they lie on this? What's the reason they lie? Let's look at the evidence and whatnot. But in today's time, we are no longer the high trust society that the West has been known for it's dying. It's dying pretty bad. So, but anyways, that's my talk. That was Empires and Pages. I really hope you enjoyed this one. Please forgive me for this long video. I didn't expect it to be this long. It's really my first time doing this, but I hope to be a bit more concise next time in some more of my videos, especially when we get into longer books. But this one's a small one, so that's why I did it all in one video. Be sure to like and subscribe, please. This is very important. It'll help me keep creating more content, and you get to know when I'm making videos. I will also be looking forward to any comments that you make, any book recommendations and suggestions. Also, please share this to everyone that you know who might find this interesting. Please and thank you. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your guys' day. God bless.